Unless you live under a rock like I do, you've probably already read this book. There's a lot of hype about it, like a lot. People hold this book nigh on sacred. It's not a bad book. It's enjoyable, but the hype that I had heard about it set me up for some expectations that it didn't quite live up to, so let's talk about it. I guess I'd better start with a brief synopsis for the people who have never read this. This book is a romance set in a fantasy world where we follow Violet Sorrengail, who is trained to be a scholar and scribe her entire life. But now her mother has demanded that she go into an extremely dangerous military school to become a dragon rider. The problem here is that Violet has a disability. She's got brittle bones and a connective tissue disorder. She's smaller and weaker than literally every other person who is going out to be a dragon rider, and people die in this school trying to become dragon riders. So the things that I liked. First of all, the main character has a disability. She has my disability. She has a connective tissue disorder, which I have a connective tissue disorder. Did we just become best friends? I, right from the get-go, really wanted to like this main character because she was representation for something that I go through. The second thing, which honestly saved this book for me, because I again went into it with some expectations set by the hype around the book that it didn't quite meet, but Xaden Riorson is worth every bit of hype that he gets. Rebecca Yarros knows how to write a romance trope. That I can say. And the love interest in this book, the broody, dark, edgy McEdgerton, who has his overprotective moments, delicious. I honestly read the book for Xaden alone, and oddly though, I'm not too fond of the chapters that are written from his perspective in the bonus stuff, because this is a special edition that has 2 extra chapters that are written from his perspective, and I honestly prefer to see him through Violet's eyes. Next, the dragons. I absolutely love the personalities of the dragons that we get. I don't think we got nearly enough of the dragons in this book, and I am heartily looking forward to reading the second one in the hopes that I get a lot more of both Xaden and the dragons. They are delightful. They're absolutely imperious and a little bit bratty, but they can be because they're dragons and they're big and strong and powerful, and they can eat us with ketchup for lunch. The book has a fair sprinkling of representation, both in the LGBTQ area and in disability. There are some disabilities that are not treated as though they are lesser people. They have jobs and they do things. And I think that's pretty cool. Sexual orientation is not something that is looked down on for any of them. And there is at least one character who uses they, them pronouns in the book. So points for that. All right, here is the section that I am gonna get lots of arguments in my comments for. Please go ahead. I am willing to be convinced. Mind you, I still have only read the first book. The second book might take some of these arguments that I have and render them null and void. But first, the world building is super weak. Yes, there is world building. I don't like how it's presented. This book has a serious issue with dialogue of information. A lot of the information, especially about the world building that we are given, is just spouted in discussion or recited by our main character as like a calming defensive coping mechanism. It is literally just info dump after info dump. There may be 3 occasions in this book where the world building information that we are given is delivered in a natural sort of way that tends to stick in the memory as part of the world and not just recitation or dialogue for the sake of inundating us with information. I usually give a book 3 chapters to draw me in. This one, I'm sorry to say, if I did not trust my friends, I would not have stuck with it. It took 7 chapters before this book became worth it for me. The beginning is very, very rocky. It has a ton of exposition given in what, in my opinion, is literally the worst delivery method, and that is through character dialogue. It's very important to have character dialogue, and character dialogue must move the story forward, yes, but there is a delicate balance, and almost all of the dialogue that is centered around world building specifically, not just the plot moving stuff, but the stuff that is about world building doesn't feel natural to me. It feels like an info dump. And it really makes me feel like this book was written specifically to be turned into a movie. And there is nothing wrong with that per se, but the hype around this book made me think that I was going to get into something that was beautifully written. And that's probably partly my fault, because I assumed that if so many people loved it, then it must be beautifully written. There must be something in the prose itself that lends itself to being an excellent experience in the reading of it. I was wrong. That is my bad. I made that assumption. The world building is pretty weak in this book. I'm hoping that in the second book we get more incorporated. It's not bad. I just feel like it needed 2 or 3 more rounds of editing. In the back of the book, she does talk about how the editing process for this took 21 days. I feel like that was really short. I do agree that this book is a diamond. I just see it as a really rough diamond that could have used a lot more time in the polishing phase. Maybe a few different facets cut in before we even got to the polishing. This is going to sound like I am repeating myself, because basically I am. There is a thing that our main character does that I cannot stand, and repeatedly made me want to set this book down, and that is when she is nervous, she just begins to spout some history or geography or something like that, and I can't stand it. And I understand that that was seen as a way to deliver information about the world, but I felt that it was pedantic and very tell, not show. There is a lot of tell, not show, and not a lot of show in this book. Don't get me wrong, there are some things that are shown to us and that are written very, very well. The book itself isn't bad. I just expected more of it. So right on the front of this book, it says, "Sexy and sizzling. Prepare to be fully spellbound by this epic fantasy." I guess technically it's in a fantasy world because there's dragons and swords and stuff, but there's very little that makes it feel like fantasy besides the dragons and the swords and stuff. This book could have been a modern fantasy with dragons, and very little would have changed. I don't feel like it's fantasy. I feel like it's fantasy flavored, and there's nothing wrong with that. It is more romance than fantasy, nothing wrong with that. But to be called an epic fantasy, I guess technically in word count, maybe, but no. The expectation that I have of something that is called an epic fantasy is a rich fantasy world with cultures, multiple, and lots of interesting things about the different cultures that are fantastical in nature and not to be found here in our real Earth. This is fantasy flavored romance, at least the first book. I'm willing to be proven wrong with the second and the third. My next 2 points I'm going to weave together. Although our main character, Violet, has a disability, and there are moments where she is challenged by it. Seems a little light on the challenge of the disability and overcoming it. I understand the sticky spot you're in when you write a character who has a disability, because you don't want to make their story entirely about the disability. You want them to be able to triumph in spite of the disability, perhaps sometimes even because of the disability, because it requires them to live life in a different way and to look at things from a different perspective. That's there in this. I like that. But there are a couple of things that I just raise my eyebrow at. Like there's a section of the book where she starts wrapping her joints to support them one after she's injured. But if she's had this disability her whole life, why didn't she do that before she was injured in order to lessen and mitigate the injuries from ever coming about? Like, that makes very little sense to someone who lives with a disability. I would have liked more time and energy dedicated to how she lives with the disability. There's a section in here, I don't want to spoil, but there is a part where we just kind of speed through some things, and I feel like that damages a lot of my suspension of disbelief because it makes the disability pretty flippant. It doesn't really matter at all for any of that because we're just gonna zoom through however many weeks of what had been built up as danger, right? It takes away a lot of the feeling of our main character being threatened. We're supposed to believe that she could be killed at any time by her classmates, and that, she puts a foot down wrong and she'll fall and twist her ankle and then be out of commission. But that, the threat is not very believable to me. And the threats that do exist, I feel, are sometimes very contrived. There is a particular action undertaken by a specific character that, for a character who follows the rules, this is a pretty big rule that you're breaking, doesn't make a whole lot of sense. Like, I get that you think that you're not going to get caught and you can get away with it, but if your whole reason for being upset on our main character is that she breaks the rules, aren't you going to find a way to do what you want to do without breaking the number one rule? I had a hard time with that one moment. And if you read it, you know what moment I'm talking about. And if you haven't read it, once you do, I'm pretty sure that you'll be able to pick out the thing that I'm talking about. Another problem that I have with this book is the death is so very heavy-handed. It's like to the point where I'm yawning because it's overused. And not just that it's overused, it's wasteful. This country apparently has been at war for a long, long time. That's why these dragon riders are so important. And they have to secure the borders against the neighboring countries that are raiding them and whatnot. But they're just going to let people fall to their death when they have dragons who can catch them, who in fact later in the book catch people who are falling. I know that there are arguments for it, the grittiness of it. It just seems like it's not very pragmatic at all. Why would these particular deaths that are so very preventable, you don't even have to let the students who are still there know that you saved the people? Like, in the very beginning, if you fail the task, you could just become a cook or something in the army, or be sent home to tend the sheep or whatever. I understand that there is something to be said for trying to winnow out only the most reliable, dependent warriors who can be unaffected by the deaths of their comrades around them. I get it, but it's really wasteful. It's not very pragmatic from a military that otherwise seems pretty pragmatic. Everything about the military in this book is based on pragmatism. Why would we let these people live? Well, there's so many of them that we are ensured really good fighters if they live through this. And if not, then they die. And that takes care of the problem now, doesn't it? And nothing written on the outside of this book says dystopia. But it's secretly a dystopia. I feel like we deserve a warning that it's a dystopia, right? Yes, there is a content warning in the beginning of the book that it says it's set in a brutal and competitive world of a military college and includes elements regarding war, battle, hand-to-hand combat, perilous situations, blood, intense violence, brutal injuries, death, poisoning, graphic language, and sexual activities that are shown on the page. But dystopia would have been a really good word to use. I don't feel like the school is even brutal. I feel like it's just wasteful. Competitive, yes. Brutal, not really. Sexual acts shown on the page. Oh, let's talk about that for a moment. I expected so much more because of all of the raving about this book. There are two spicy scenes. And the first one isn't that great. I mean, 3 if you count the kiss, which was a really good scene. The scene where they are first together in totality for the first time was boring to me, and perhaps it is just that I have been reading spice for a very long time, and the spice that I am used to reading is a lot spicier. But this, I wouldn't even call it primal, although I get that that's what the aim was going for, a primal need for each other with a disregard of physical possessions, and they only exist for each other in that moment. Okay, there was very little lead in. It was all just like kissing and groping and banging against things, and then they were doing the spice, and then it was over. The second time that they were together, I feel, was much better written, and I guess since they had like bled off the urgency that they had been building up through the entire time of this enemies to lovers, it's a medium burn, okay? This is a medium burn. I would give it like 2 chilies. Maybe 3, maybe. This is not Anne Rice. This is not Laurel K. Hamilton. This is not Jacqueline Carey. I'm sorry. If you've never read Spice before, this will probably seem really spicy. But I didn't even need the proverbial glass of milk, okay? As the SMUT goes, this was kind of SMT. My final thoughts are that this feels like a debut novel, which I know it's not. It's a debut fantasy novel. The author is going into fantasy as a genre for the first time with this book. She has written other books that are romances, and I can feel the strength of her romance writing, but the fantasy part of it feels like a debut novel, like a writer who doesn't understand the genre, who hasn't read enough fantasy, a writer who doesn't have other things about fantasy books that she likes and wants to emulate. She doesn't understand the formula, I think, of a fantasy novel and what makes a good fantasy novel. She understands a romance novel. And this is a great romance novel. But like I said earlier, this is fantasy flavored. If you separate fantasy and romantasy in the bookstore and you put this in fantasy, no, this does not belong in fantasy. This belongs very firmly in the romantasy category because this is a fantasy flavored romance. I'm willing to get more fantasy in the next 2 books, and I really hope that she gives us more fantasy in the next 2 books. But there wasn't enough in it for me to call it a fantasy. Like I said before, I think this needed a lot more editing. I think that it really could have lived up to the hype with maybe 2, maybe 3 more rounds of editing. But this woman does not write slowly. She releases like 2 books a year, and so her cycle for editing, I'm sure, is pretty streamlined. But when you're breaking into a new genre, maybe give it a little more time. Maybe let it stew, let it breathe, step away from it, and then come back to it and read it with some fresh eyes. Because as a long-time fantasy reader, this did not scratch my fantasy itch at all. I had to read a different epic fantasy in order to feel like I was reading fantasy. I can't even apologize for saying it because I truly feel it from the depths of my heart that this book could have been so much better. Not that it was bad, but it could have been so much better. I think that the hype does this book a really great disservice. There's a lot of things that are not said when people are talking about this book for the sake of not spoiling, and I appreciate that, but with a few specific keywords, the idea of this book could be delivered in a way that sets expectations for it much better than the viral hype of social media that it's riding on. I'm really glad that Rebecca Yarros is making money on this. We deserve more really big fantasy novels and romance in fantasy. I wanted to give it a better review, and I can't because the expectations that were set by the people who recommended the book to me. It's really hard to not form an opinion about something when somebody else is telling you that this is the greatest thing ever. I don't think it's the greatest thing ever. It's great, but I don't think it's the greatest thing ever. I'm so sorry. I have a different problem, and this is probably one of my own making, but my books don't match because I bought this one just on a whim thinking, I don't even know if I'll like it, so I got the one that was available without looking any deeper to see if I could find a hardback. So this is in paperback, and that means that on the shelf, my books don't match. That's a problem, because I'm a perfectly normal person who can stand their books not matching on their bookshelf. No, not at all. The text blocks are very similar sizes, however, so I think I can fix this. I think I can just rebind them and make them look the same on the shelf, and everything will be okay. I will obviously, since I have it in my hand, be reading the second one. I have hopes for it, but my hopes are tempered by my experience with the first novel, and so while I hope to be pleasantly surprised, I have a baseline expectation for this book now. I think I will enjoy it a whole lot better than the first one. I also think that doing a buddy read on Storygraph and stopping to voice my opinion with every chapter damaged my experience of this book. I think that if I had just allowed myself to devour it like the potato chip reading that it is, that I would have had a better experience while I was reading the book. I did not just finish reading this. I put it away and I gave myself some time to collect my thoughts. And between the hype and the stopping every chapter to write down what I thought and take notes, I think that really damaged my overall experience of what the book is. I highly recommend that if you're going to read this book, don't stop after every chapter. Don't take notes. Read it a second time if you're going to take notes, because I think that the way the prose is written, it really does lend itself to potato chip book reading, and it needs to be binged. I don't think that it stands by itself very well when you're not binging it. So my final recommendation for this book is, if you would like to read a medium burn, enemies to lovers, romance, dystopia with fantasy elements, and you're okay with a lot of dialogue of information, this book is great, but I have 2 warnings for you. 1, there is a POV switch at the end of the book. If that is going to affect you, please be prepared for it. 2, the plot is a little bit of a bait and switch. We go in thinking that we're going to get 3 books about a specific thing. I can all but guarantee you that the second book is not going to be the same formula as the first. And that's all I'm going to tell you, because I'm not going to spoil anything. I just need to have my expectations managed. And if you're like me, those are the warnings that you need in order to truly enjoy this book. Thank you for sticking around. If you have already read it, please let me know what you liked. Do you have a counterpoint to anything that I've said? I would really love to hear your opinion. I'm willing to change my stance on a lot of things. I just can only speak from my experience. Who was your favorite character? I will tell you that every person that I'm like, oh, this is my favorite character, except for the main love interest, yeah, that's a big dead sign on top of their heads. This is nothing new. My favorite characters always die. So I knew I knew from the moment he was introduced that he was going to die. And then I knew from the moment that he was introduced that he was going to die, because I was like, oh no, I really like him. I can see the big dead neon signs above their heads the moment that they appear in the book. If you haven't read this yet, don't go down reading the comments, because there's probably going to be spoilers, so just be mindful and put your blinders on, unless, you know, spoiling yourself is the kind of thing that you're into. We don't cast aspersions on what people like here. But if you haven't read it yet, let me know what you think that you're going to get into when you read it. Let me know what would make this a good book for you and what would make it a bad book for you. I promise you, I'm starting this book tonight because I don't have to keep my brain pure about this book and not cross over events of the second novel. The third book comes out today, but if this video does well, I'm not going to read the third one until I've posted a review of the second one. If this video bombs, then I'm just going to read to my heart's content, because if nobody cares, then nobody cares, and I'm not going to take my time to do it. But if you liked this video, please give me a thumbs up. You can think about subscribing. This channel is not just about books. This is about crafting a life worth living, and sometimes that's going to include books, sometimes that's going to include rebinding books, and sometimes it's going to be doing whatever it is that makes my life worth living for me. So you don't have to subscribe if that's not your thing. But I appreciate your watch time, and I really, really appreciate it if you would give me a comment of some kind, even if it's a couple of emoji, and give the video a thumbs up. That really, really helps it do well in the algorithm and reach more people. I appreciate you. I appreciate your time. Please do me a favor and make sure that you are hydrated. Make sure that you're eating something nutritious so that we do not become weak and feeble like Violet Sorengale. We must strengthen ourselves for the tasks and adventures ahead. And remember to do something just for you. Craft a life worth living. I promise I'm doing my best to take care of your friend, so please do your best to take care of mine. I'll see you next week.